David Candler's muscles ached, a familiar dull throb that accompanied every long hike. He loved it, though. The strain, the exhaustion, the way it made him feel alive after days spent sitting in front of a screen. Today's hike at Cedar Creek had been particularly challenging. The rugged trails twisted and climbed steeply, giving way to panoramic views of the sprawling forest below. But as breathtaking as the vistas were, David was more than ready to be home. His legs protested with every step as he made his way back to his car, parked at the trailhead. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky tinged with the last hues of twilight. By the time David turned onto the winding back roads that led through Cedar Creek, night had fully set in. The roads here were notorious for being tricky, especially in the dark. They twisted and turned with little warning, flanked on either side by dense trees that loomed over the road, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. David rolled down his window, hoping the cool night air would help keep him alert. The rhythmic hum of his tires on the pavement, combined with the monotony of the dark, twisting road, lulled him into a kind of trance. His mind wandered, replaying scenes from his hike, his conversation with a fellow hiker about how the park's untouched beauty had a kind of ancient, untamed wildness about it. There was something different about Cedar Creek, something that made it feel more isolated, more primal than other places he'd been. But that peaceful reverie shattered when something caught his eye. It was a figure, a person, standing by the roadside. David blinked and leaned forward, trying to see more clearly through the inky darkness. At first, he thought it might be a deer or some other animal, but as his headlights illuminated the figure, he realized it was a boy. David's heart skipped a beat. The boy couldn't have been more than 11 or 12 years old. Standing there alone in the night, his arms wrapped around himself as if he were cold. His face was pale, and his wide eyes darted nervously between the road and the dark forest behind him, as though he was being watched or pursued. "What the?" David muttered under his breath as he slowed the car to a stop. His instincts as a father kicked in immediately. This boy was out here alone, at night, in the middle of nowhere. Something was very wrong. He rolled down the passenger side window, leaning across the seat to get a better look at the boy. "Hey, kid," David called out, his voice cutting through the quiet night. "Are you okay?" The boy didn't respond at first. He just stood there, staring at David with those frightened eyes. David could see the boy was shivering, though whether it was from the cold or from fear, he couldn't tell. His clothes seemed odd, too. An old-fashioned jacket that looked out of place, like something from a decade or two ago. Concern gnawed at David. This boy shouldn't be out here, not alone, not at this hour. David looked around, but there were no other cars, no houses nearby, and certainly no one else who might be looking for the child. He tried again, his voice softer, more reassuring this time. "Do you need help? Are you lost? I can give you a ride home if you want." For the first time the boy's lips moved, though his voice was barely a whisper. "I can't find my way home," he said, his words trembling in the cold air. David's heart ached at the sound of the boy's voice, so full of helplessness and fear. "I can help you," he offered quickly, not wanting to scare the boy off. "Where do you live? I can take you home, or we can find someone to help." But before David could finish, something strange happened. The boy's eyes, which had been wide with fear, suddenly grew even wider. His expression shifted from mere confusion and fear to full-blown panic. His small hands clenched into fists at his sides, and his entire body seemed to stiffen. "Don't let me in," the boy suddenly screamed, his voice loud and sharp in the stillness of the night. David jerked back, startled by the intensity of the boy's outburst. His heart pounded in his chest, and he blinked in disbelief. "What?" David stammered, trying to process what had just happened. The boy's sudden change in demeanor had left him completely unprepared. "Why not? What do you mean?" But the boy didn't answer. He turned, his movements quick and jerky, and before David could react, the boy ran, sprinting toward the dense forest that bordered the road. His small figure disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by the shadows of the trees within seconds. David sat there, frozen for a moment, staring at the spot where the boy had vanished. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Should he follow the boy? Should he call the police? 1,000 questions flooded his thoughts, each one more confusing than the last. For a few long seconds, David didn't move. His hands still gripped the steering wheel, his heart still thudding in his chest. Something about the boy's panicked warning replayed in his mind. "Don't let me in." Why had the boy said that? What was he afraid of? Why run into the woods? Eventually, David shook his head, trying to dispel the lingering feeling of unease. He looked at the darkened tree line, half expecting the boy to reappear. But the road remained empty, silent, as if the encounter had never happened. Reluctantly, David put the car back into drive and continued on his way, his mind replaying the scene over and over again. As the miles passed, the memory of the boy's voice seemed to echo in his thoughts, growing louder with each repetition. By the time he reached home, the encounter had become something more than a strange, unsettling experience. It had become a mystery that gnawed at him, refusing to be forgotten. Even as he collapsed into bed, exhausted from the day's hike and the long drive, David couldn't shake the image of the boy, standing alone on the side of the road, his face pale, his voice trembling as he whispered, "Help me. I can't find my way home." And then, louder, more urgent, "Don't let me in." The next morning, David woke up feeling uneasy. His night had been filled with restless tossing and turning, the strange encounter on the dark roads of Cedar Creek replaying in his mind over and over again. Each time, the boy's voice, soft at first but rising to a shout, cut through his thoughts. "Don't let me in." The words rang out like an alarm, stirring something in David he couldn't quite understand. The boy's terrified expression, his sudden flight into the woods, lingered in David's consciousness, like a vivid dream that refused to fade upon waking. David sat on the edge of his bed, running a hand through his unkempt hair as he tried to shake off the lingering unease. He reasoned that it had been a stressful, confusing situation. Perhaps the boy was scared of something else. Maybe the child had seen someone or something in the woods that frightened him, and he panicked. But then, why had he told David not to help him? Why had he screamed so desperately for David to stay away? As he made his way through the motions of his morning routine, coffee, breakfast, a quick check of emails, David found himself distracted. He couldn't stop thinking about the boy. Where had he gone after running into the woods? Had he made it home safely, or was he still out there, lost and afraid? David considered calling the local police or park rangers to report the strange encounter. But what would he say? That he had seen a boy by the road who screamed not to let him in and then ran into the forest? It seemed too bizarre, too confusing, and frankly, David didn't want to sound like a paranoid fool. Besides, the boy had clearly chosen to leave. If he had wanted help, he would have stayed. Yet, despite all these rationalizations, David couldn't shake the gnawing sense that something was wrong. As the hours passed, that sense of unease grew stronger, pulling at his thoughts like an insistent whisper at the back of his mind. He tried to focus on work, answering a few emails and making a few calls, but his attention kept drifting back to the boy. By midday, David could no longer ignore the nagging feeling. Curiosity gnawed at him, an almost irrational need to understand what had happened and why. Maybe it was because he had children of his own, 2 teenagers, who despite their growing independence, still leaned on him for guidance and support. The thought of one of them being in a situation like that boy, lost and scared, stirred an instinctual need in him to protect and help. What if the boy truly was in danger? What if something had happened to him after he ran into the woods? By mid-afternoon, David made up his mind. He had to go back. Even if he didn't find anything, even if it turned out to be nothing more than a frightened child's misunderstanding, he couldn't just sit at home and let the mystery gnaw at him. David left the house, locking the door behind him, and headed toward his car. His hands felt strangely cold as he gripped the steering wheel. Even though the weather was mild for late autumn, the sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows across the landscape as he drove toward Cedar Creek, retracing the path he had taken just 2 nights before. The drive felt longer this time, the winding roads more oppressive. David noticed details he hadn't paid attention to before. The dense, towering trees lining the road, the thick undergrowth that seemed to close in around him as he drove deeper into the forest. The road was empty, as it had been that night, and the stillness of the surrounding woods seemed unnaturally quiet. It was the kind of silence that made even the smallest sounds, his car's engine, the crunch of gravel beneath the tires, seem loud and intrusive. David eventually reached the spot where he had seen the boy. He pulled over, turning off the car and sitting in the silence for a moment, just listening. The forest around him was still, the shadows growing longer as the sun continued its slow dip below the horizon. It looked different in the daylight, less eerie, but still isolated. There were no houses in sight, no signs of any nearby buildings or communities, just miles of dense trees stretching in every direction. David stepped out of the car and scanned the area, hoping to spot something, anything, that would give him a clue as to what had happened to the boy. He thought about calling out, but the idea of shouting into the quiet, empty woods felt wrong, somehow. Instead, he walked slowly along the roadside, his eyes trained on the trees, looking for any sign of movement. After about 20 minutes of searching, David was about to give up when he noticed something. Through the trees, just a short walk from the road, there was a house, small and old, with a weathered exterior that seemed to blend in with the natural surroundings. It looked like it had been there for years, its wooden walls worn by time and the elements. Curious, David approached the house. As he got closer, he noticed that the front yard was overgrown, the grass long and unkempt. There was no car in sight, and no signs of life, except for a thin wisp of smoke curling up from the chimney, indicating that someone was inside. David hesitated for a moment. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but something compelled him to knock on the door. Maybe whoever lived here knew something about the boy. Maybe the boy had come here for help. He knocked on the weathered wooden door, the sound echoing through the quiet air. For a long moment there was no response, and David was about to turn and leave when he heard the creak of footsteps from inside. The door slowly opened, and standing in the doorway was an elderly woman, her face lined with age and her hair a soft, silvery white. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice soft but curious. David cleared his throat, feeling slightly awkward. I'm sorry to bother you, ma'am. I was driving by this area a couple of nights ago, and I saw a young boy standing by the road. He seemed lost and scared, and, well, he ran into the woods before I could help him. I was wondering if you might know anything about him." The woman's expression changed subtly at the mention of the boy, her brow furrowing as she regarded David with a mix of concern and hesitation. After a moment of silence, she opened the door wider and motioned for him to come inside. "I think you'd better come in," she said quietly. David stepped into the house, the warmth of the interior washing over him as the door closed softly behind him. The house was small and cluttered with old furniture, framed photographs, and the kind of knickknacks that accumulate over a lifetime. It had a cozy, lived-in feel, but there was something else, a weight in the air, as though the very walls held on to secrets. The woman led David to a small sitting room where she motioned for him to sit in an armchair by the fire. She sat across from him in a wooden rocking chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "What you saw? It wasn't just a lost boy," she began, her voice low. "It was Sam." David frowned, unsure what she meant. "Sam?" The woman nodded slowly, her gaze distant, as though she were looking into the past. "Sam disappeared over 20 years ago. He was a local boy, lived right here in Riverbend. One evening, just like the one you described, he vanished on his way home. And ever since then, he's been seen by strangers, always lost, always asking for help." David's heart skipped a beat as her words sank in. The boy hadn't been lost. He had been something else. Something David couldn't yet understand. David sat in the warmth of the old woman's house, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, but despite the cozy surroundings, he felt a chill. The woman's words had unnerved him, and he found himself struggling to process what she had just said. A boy who disappeared 20 years ago, and yet David had seen him, standing right there by the road, lost and pleading for help, just 2 nights before. How could that be possible? "Sam?" David echoed, trying to make sense of it all. "You said he disappeared 20 years ago. But I saw him. He was standing right there by the road. He was real." The woman, who had introduced herself as Mrs. Alden, nodded slowly. Her eyes, tired and heavy with the weight of years, seemed to carry a sadness that went deeper than words. Yes, you saw him, she replied, her voice soft, almost reverent, as though she were speaking about something sacred, something beyond the natural world. Many people do, but only once a year, always on the anniversary of his disappearance. Every year, a traveler passes through and sees Sam. He always looks the same, just as he did the night he vanished. Lost, afraid, and asking for help. David felt a strange tightness in his chest. What do you mean, the anniversary? He asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Sam disappeared 21 years ago, almost to the day, Mrs. Alden explained, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap. He was walking home from school. His house was just a short distance down the road, not far from here. But he never made it home. He was last seen standing by the side of the road, just like you saw him. And after that, he was gone. No trace of him was ever found, no footprints, no signs of struggle, nothing. David leaned forward, his mind racing. But how is that possible? I mean, if he's gone, if it's been that long, how can I have seen him? How can anyone see him? Mrs. Alden's gaze drifted toward the window, where the darkening woods loomed just beyond the glass. That's the question that's haunted us all for years, she said softly. Riverbend is a small town, and everyone knew Sam. When he disappeared, it devastated his family, and the whole community was shaken. Search parties went out for weeks, combing the woods, the riverbanks, everywhere he could have gone, but they found nothing. David felt a pang of sympathy for the boy and his family. The thought of losing a child, of having them simply vanish without a trace, was horrifying. But the idea that he had somehow seen the boy, years after he had disappeared, sent shivers down his spine. And every year someone sees him? David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes. Alden confirmed, her eyes still distant, as if lost in some painful memory. A traveler, someone passing through the area. Sam only ever appears to strangers. He stands by the side of the road, always in the same spot, looking lost and scared. He asks for help, but as soon as someone offers it, he warns them, just like he warned you, "Don't let me in." David swallowed hard, the words echoing in his mind. Don't let me in. At the time, it had been confusing. Why would the boy ask for help and then immediately refuse it? But now, it seemed more ominous, more like a warning. Why does he say that? David asked. Why doesn't he want help? Mrs. Alden hesitated for a moment before answering, as though she were weighing her words carefully. That's the part none of us can explain. Some say it's because he knows he can't leave. Whatever happened to him that night, whatever took him, it won't let him go. And he knows it. He's trying to protect the people who stopped to help him, trying to keep them from suffering the same fate. David felt a shiver run down his spine. The thought of something in the woods, something dark and unseen, holding the boy captive for years, it was almost too much to comprehend. And yet, he had seen the boy with his own eyes. The fear in Sam's voice, the terror in his eyes, it had been real. David couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was at play. Do you believe that? David asked cautiously, watching Mrs. Alden's face closely. Do you think there's something out there, something that took him? Mrs. Alden's expression darkened, and she leaned back in her chair, her hands trembling slightly. I've lived in this town my whole life, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I've heard the stories, the legends about the woods, about the things people have seen out there. Most of them are just old folk tales, things to scare children. But after Sam disappeared, people started talking. They said there were places in the woods where you shouldn't go, places where the trees are older than the town itself, places where the air feels different, colder, darker. David frowned, leaning forward slightly. What do you mean by darker? She turned her gaze toward him, her eyes sharp and focused. There are stories about people who went too far into the woods and never came back. Old hunters, hikers, even a few kids over the years. They say the woods change the deeper you go. You lose your way, and something out there watches you. There's a presence. Some say it's ancient, something that was here long before the town was founded, and it doesn't take kindly to trespassers. David shifted in his seat, uneasy. He had always enjoyed hiking in Cedar Creek, but the idea of an ancient, malevolent presence lurking in the woods made his stomach churn. He wasn't sure if he believed in the supernatural, but after seeing Sam, he couldn't completely dismiss the possibility that there was more to these woods than met the eye. "Do you think that's what took Sam?" David asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Alden sighed, her eyes heavy with sorrow. "I don't know. All I know is that Sam hasn't left this place. Not really. Every year, he appears, and every year someone sees him just like you did. But no one has ever been able to help him, and no one has ever dared to follow him into the woods." David felt a knot form in his stomach at her words. The thought of following Sam, of venturing deeper into the woods to find out what had happened, was both terrifying and compelling. He wanted answers. He needed to understand why Sam had appeared to him, why the boy had been so afraid. But the idea of going into those dark woods, where something might still be waiting, sent chills down his spine. "You said people see him every year," David said after a long pause. "Has anyone ever tried to help him? Has anyone ever tried to follow him?" Mrs. Alden's gaze dropped to the floor, her expression grave. "A few have tried," she admitted softly, "but none of them made it far. The woods, they don't let you in easily. Something about the air changes, and you lose your way. One man claimed he heard voices whispering to him from the trees, leading him deeper and deeper. Others said they felt like they were being watched, followed. They never made it back to the spot where Sam disappeared." David's heart raced at the thought of it. Getting lost in the woods, hearing strange voices, feeling a presence watching you from the shadows. He knew it sounded crazy, like something out of a ghost story, but after what he had experienced, he couldn't dismiss it entirely. For a long time they sat in silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the soft ticking of a clock on the mantel. Finally, Mrs. Alden spoke again, her voice quiet and sad. "You did the right thing, driving away that night. Sam warned you for a reason. Whatever took him, it's still out there. And it doesn't like visitors." David nodded slowly, though his mind was far from settled. He had more questions now than ever before, but he wasn't sure he wanted the answers. Whatever was out there in the woods, whatever had taken Sam, it was something beyond his understanding. And yet, a part of him couldn't let it go. He needed to know the truth, no matter how dangerous it might be. David left Mrs. Alden's house with a heavy weight on his chest, his mind buzzing with questions that refused to settle. The cold evening air hit him as he stepped outside, a biting reminder of how far the night had come since he first arrived. The shadows had grown longer, more oppressive, and the once tranquil woods now seemed to loom over him, thick with mystery. As he walked back to his car, Mrs. Alden's words echoed in his mind. Whatever took him, it's still out there. David shuddered involuntarily, despite his best efforts to keep himself composed. He hadn't planned on getting tangled up in something like this, something that felt bigger, darker, and more dangerous than anything he'd ever encountered. But now that he was in the middle of it, he felt a strange pull, a magnetic force drawing him deeper into the mystery. He couldn't just walk away, not now. Sitting in his car, he stared out into the woods, thinking. He wasn't a superstitious man by any means, but this defied all rational explanation. A boy disappearing over 2 decades ago, only to reappear each year on the anniversary, lost, afraid, and still somehow the same age as the day he vanished? David would have laughed it off as a campfire story under any other circumstances. But he had seen Sam with his own eyes, heard the boy's desperate voice, felt the fear that radiated from him like a tangible thing. The woods were quiet now, the silence unnerving in its own way. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something, some event, some revelation to unfold. David wasn't sure what compelled him to stay, but he knew he couldn't leave. Not yet. He glanced at the clock on his dashboard. 8:23 p.m. It would be full dark soon. He'd have a few hours before the moon reached its peak, and while every rational part of his mind screamed for him to turn around and drive home, a deeper, more primal instinct urged him forward. He needed to know what was out there. Against his better judgment, David grabbed his flashlight from the glove compartment, his hand brushing against the cool metal. He had no plan, no real sense of what he was going to do, but his feet moved before his mind could protest. Stepping out of the car, he ventured toward the edge of the woods, where the trees stood tall and ominous, their branches swaying gently in the evening breeze. As he crossed the threshold from the road into the forest, a strange sensation washed over him, an unease, like the very air around him had changed. The temperature seemed to drop a few degrees, and the sounds of the night, crickets, wind, distant rustling, faded into a muted hum. The woods, once alive with the usual nocturnal noises, now felt oppressively silent. David paused, shining his flashlight into the trees, the beam cutting through the darkness, but revealing little more than the trunks of trees and thick undergrowth. He hadn't ventured far yet, but already the sense of disorientation was creeping in. It was like the forest itself was shifting, rearranging its paths just out of view, making it difficult to determine which way was forward and which way led back. "Keep your head straight," he thought to himself, shaking off the creeping fear. He knew that if he let his nerves get the best of him now, it would only make things worse. He took a deep breath, focusing on the trail ahead. There had to be something here. Some clue, some sign of what had happened to Sam. As David moved deeper into the woods, he began to notice subtle changes. The trees grew thicker, the gaps between them narrower, and the underbrush became more tangled. The air seemed heavier, almost oppressive, pressing down on him like an invisible weight. Every few minutes he'd stop, turning his head to listen for any sound, any movement, but all he heard was the steady thud of his own heartbeat. Then, just when he was starting to feel the first stirrings of doubt, wondering if this had all been a mistake, he heard it. A voice, faint, distant, but unmistakable. "Help me." David's heart leapt in his chest. The voice was soft, barely a whisper, but it was there. Sam. Without thinking, David moved toward the sound, his flashlight trembling slightly in his grip. He pushed through the thickening undergrowth, his footsteps crunching on the dead leaves beneath him. The trees seemed to close in around him, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal arms, but he pressed on. "Help me." The voice again, this time closer. David's pulse quickened. He was close, he could feel it. But as he moved forward, something else began to creep into his awareness. A feeling, cold and unsettling. The forest, once just a collection of trees and shadows, now felt alive. There was a presence here, something watching him from the darkness, just out of sight. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch, sent a jolt of fear through him, but he couldn't stop now. Finally, he broke through a particularly thick patch of underbrush and found himself standing in a small clearing. His flashlight beam cut across the space, revealing something strange, something out of place. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient oak tree, its massive trunk gnarled and twisted, its branches reaching up into the sky like jagged claws. But what caught David's attention was what lay at the base of the tree. A backpack. Old, weathered, covered in dirt and leaves. It was small, the kind a young boy might carry to school. David's heart skipped a beat. He knew, without a doubt, that this was Sam's backpack. The same one he'd been wearing the night he disappeared. As David approached the tree, his hands trembling slightly, the air around him seemed to grow even colder. There was something unnatural about this place, something wrong. The ground felt wrong beneath his feet, almost as if it were pulsing with some unseen energy. "Please." The voice came again, this time louder, more desperate. David spun around, his flashlight sweeping across the clearing, but there was no one there. The voice seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. His heart pounded in his chest, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Then, without warning, the beam of his flashlight flickered. Once, twice, and then it went out. Darkness swallowed him. David's breath caught in his throat, his hands fumbling with the flashlight, trying to get it to turn back on. But the more he tried, the more panicked he became. His pulse raced, the cold grip of fear tightening around him, and then he heard it. A rustling sound, coming from the trees, slow, deliberate. David froze, his heart hammering in his chest. He could feel it now. The presence. Something was watching him. Something was moving closer. The rustling grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from all directions, surrounding him. Panic surged through him as he turned in a circle, trying to see through the oppressive darkness. But there was nothing. Nothing but the sound of something moving closer, closer. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the rustling stopped. Silence fell over the clearing once more, thick and suffocating. David stood still, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. He didn't know what had just happened, but every instinct screamed at him to run, to get out of the woods as fast as he could. But as he turned to flee, something caught his eye. Something in the darkness. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing, just barely visible in the faint light of the moon. Small, motionless, watching. It was Sam. David's breath hitched in his throat. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, barely illuminated by the slivers of moonlight that filtered through the thick canopy, was Sam. The boy was motionless, his face pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. David's heart pounded in his chest, his pulse a relentless drumbeat in his ears. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move, frozen in place by a fear he had never known before. For a long, agonizing moment, neither of them moved. David could feel the weight of the woods pressing down on him, the stillness unnerving in its intensity. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "Sam?" David's voice came out as a hoarse whisper, barely audible over the pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure if the boy could hear him, or if he even wanted Sam to hear him. Part of him, the rational part, was screaming that this couldn't be real. Sam was gone. This was impossible, but here he was, standing there looking just as he had the night David first saw him on the road. Sam didn't respond. He didn't even blink. He simply stared at David, his expression a mask of fear and sorrow. David felt his stomach twist into knots. There was something deeply wrong about this situation, something unnatural. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to turn away. The wind picked up slightly, causing the branches above to rustle softly. David swallowed hard, trying to steady his nerves. He took a cautious step forward, his hands trembling. "Sam, I want to help you. Please, tell me what happened to you." For the first time, the boy's expression changed. His lips parted slightly, and a faint sound escaped him, like a sigh carried on the wind. His eyes, wide and filled with something David couldn't quite place, shifted ever so slightly, as if he was looking past David, toward something deeper in the woods. David followed his gaze, turning slowly to look behind him. The clearing stretched out, the shadows growing longer, darker, more oppressive. He could feel it now, the presence he had sensed earlier. It was closer, surrounding him. The air had grown colder, the temperature dropping rapidly as the silence of the woods pressed down on him. Suddenly there was movement, a rustling sound, low and menacing, like something large and unseen shifting through the trees. David's heart leaped into his throat as he spun back toward Sam, but the boy was already moving. Without warning, Sam bolted, his small figure darting into the thick woods with startling speed, vanishing into the darkness before David could even process what had happened. "Wait!" David shouted, his voice cracking in the cold air. His legs finally broke free of their paralysis, and he ran after the boy, plunging into the dense undergrowth. Branches whipped at his face, thorns scratched at his arms, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Sam was ahead, barely visible, just out of reach, his small figure darting between the trees like a fleeting shadow. "Sam, stop!" David called again, his voice frantic. "I can help you." But Sam didn't stop. He moved deeper into the forest, leading David further away from the clearing, further from any recognizable path. The trees grew thicker, their twisted branches blocking out what little light remained. The darkness closed in around David like a living thing, suffocating, pressing down on him. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the chase ended. David burst into another clearing, smaller this time, more enclosed by the towering trees. Sam was standing in the center, facing away from David, his back turned. David stopped, gasping for breath, his chest burning from the exertion. His eyes darted around, searching the shadows, but there was no sign of the presence he had felt earlier. The woods were eerily silent once again, as though they were waiting for something. "Sam," David said, his voice hoarse. "Please, I just want to help." The boy didn't move for a moment, and David felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. Slowly, cautiously, he stepped forward, inching closer to Sam. His pulse raced, the air around him growing colder with each step. He didn't know what he was expecting, but every instinct told him that whatever happened next would change everything. And then Sam spoke. "Please," the boy whispered, his voice trembling, "don't let me in." David froze, the words hitting him like a physical blow. They were the same words Sam had said that night by the roadside. But now, in the heart of the dark woods, they carried a different weight, a deeper meaning. Before David could respond, Sam slowly turned to face him, and what David saw made his blood run cold. Sam's eyes were filled with terror, but there was something else, something darker, lurking just beneath the surface. His face was pale, too pale, as though all the life had been drained from him, and his hands, they were trembling, clutching at the front of his old-fashioned jacket, his knuckles white with fear. But it wasn't just fear. It was something worse, something unnatural. "Please," Sam whispered again, his voice cracking. "It's here." David's heart skipped a beat. "What's here?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sam didn't answer. Instead, his eyes widened in terror, and he took a step backward, away from David, his gaze darting toward the trees behind him. David followed his gaze, but all he saw was darkness, thick, impenetrable, endless. And then, without warning, the ground beneath David's feet seemed to shift, as if the very earth itself was alive. He stumbled, his flashlight falling from his grasp and flickering out as it hit the ground. The darkness swallowed him whole. Suddenly, the rustling sound returned, louder, more menacing, like something huge moving through the trees. David's breath caught in his throat as he backed away, his hands trembling. He couldn't see anything, but he could feel it. The presence, it was here. And it was coming. "Sam!" David shouted, his voice breaking with fear. "Sam, run!" But Sam didn't move. He stood frozen in place, his eyes locked on the trees, as if he was seeing something David couldn't. And then it emerged. David didn't know what he was looking at, couldn't comprehend it. The thing that stepped out of the shadows defied all logic, all reason. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form shifting and writhing like smoke, like shadow. Its eyes, or what passed for eyes, glowed faintly in the darkness, pinpricks of light that seemed to pierce through David's very soul. The air grew colder, the temperature plummeting, as the thing moved closer, its presence suffocating, overwhelming. David's legs felt weak, his body paralyzed with fear. He wanted to run, to scream, but he couldn't move. He could only watch as the thing approached, its form twisting and undulating in the darkness. And then, just as it reached the edge of the clearing, it stopped. Its eyes locked onto David, and for a brief, terrifying moment, he felt its hunger, its malice. But before it could come any closer, Sam moved. With a sudden, desperate cry, the boy darted forward, placing himself between David and the creature. His small body trembled with fear, but his voice was steady. "Please," Sam whispered, his eyes filled with both terror and determination. "Don't let me in." And then, before David could react, Sam was gone. The boy disappeared into the shadows, swallowed by the darkness along with the creature, leaving David standing alone in the clearing, the silence once again suffocating. David stood there, breathless, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on him. The woods were quiet now, as if nothing had ever happened. But he knew. He had seen it, felt it. Whatever had taken Sam, whatever still lingered in these woods, it wasn't gone. Not entirely. He had barely escaped, but Sam had saved him. But at what cost? David knew he would never forget that night, never forget the boy's warning, his final plea, "Don't let me in." As David stumbled back through the woods, the presence no longer looming over him, he understood one thing. Some mysteries weren't meant to be solved. Some doors were better left closed. And some warnings, no matter how strange, were meant to be heeded. Because whatever was out there in the woods, it wasn't done yet. And it would wait. It would wait for the next traveler, the next stranger. Just as it had waited for David.